For centuries it stood there, hidden beneath stones and silence, a forgotten hill ignored by tourist maps, far from the most talked about historical routes. But for those who believe the Bible is not just a sacred book, but a faithful witness to human history, this hill may hold one of the most astonishing discoveries of modern archaeology. The place is called Mount Ebal, and there, amid dry winds and rugged rocks, something was uncovered that could rewrite the foundations of faith and history. It was Adam Zertel, an Israeli archaeologist from the University of Haifa, who first realized that this place concealed more than dust and gravel. He wasn't there in search of miracles or spiritual glories. He was a scientist, a skeptic by nature, conducting a topographical survey in the Samaria region in 1980. But as with so many stories that changed the world, the revelation didn't come with fanfare. It came with silence, with patience, and with attentive eyes. What he found may be, according to some scholars, the altar built by Joshua, as described in chapter 8 of the book of Joshua. The Bible says that Joshua, after conquering Ai, led the people of Israel to a barren hill, where he erected an altar to God, with rough, unhewn stones in direct obedience to the law of Moses. There were no walls around this altar. There were no ornaments, only simple stones, a weary people, and the commitment to renew a sacred covenant. There he offered burnt offerings, read the law to everyone, including the foreigners, and divided the people between Mount Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing, and Mount Ebal, the Mount of Cursing. It was a solemn act, a milestone in the spiritual journey of a nation. But for many, this narrative seemed to be just that, a story, a tradition without archaeological basis, until the remnants began to demand attention. When Zertel and his team began excavating the slope of Mount Ebal, they found something that at first glance didn't seem impressive, a pile of rectangular stones, half buried in the dry earth. But as the work progressed, the outlines of the structure began to emerge. It wasn't a house, it wasn't a tower, it wasn't a tomb. It was something older, something different. A rectangle measuring 9 by 7 meters, with an ascending ramp, not stairs. An important detail that aligns with Exodus 20:26, where God commands that altars have no steps, to preserve the reverence of the priest. Around the structure, the archaeologists found layers of ash, and within them, over 1,000 fragments of burnt bones. They weren't human bones. They were from animals, sheep, goats, young cattle, exactly as prescribed in the book of Leviticus for sacrifices. Nearby, pottery fragments indicated an approximate date, around 1200 BC, the period when, according to the Bible, Israel was conquering Canaan. But perhaps most significantly, no signs of daily life were found there. No ovens, no houses, no traces of farming or habitation. Nothing to suggest this was a lived-in place. Everything indicated it was a site visited for a single purpose: worship. Zertel took 5 years to dare publish his hypothesis. He knew the academic world would hardly accept such a conclusion, but he wrote it anyway. We weren't looking for Joshua's altar. It found us. The silence that followed his publication was loud. Few responded. Many ridiculed. The prevailing argument was simple: coincidence. But the bones remained. The stones did too. And over time, other voices began to rise, not to replace science, but to unite faith and excavation in a single narrative. Decades later, with technological advances, the hill was revisited, this time with digital eyes. LiDAR, drones, 3D reconstructions, geological scans. And what emerged was surprising. The structure was symmetrical, intentional, aligned with Mosaic precepts. The absence of steps, the double platform, the exclusive use of unhewn stones. There was no foreign cultural signature, only the silent fidelity to an ancient commandment. Archaeologist Scott Stripling, decades after Zertel, returned to the hill to reassess what had been overlooked. His team used not shovels, but algorithms, not brushes, but sensors. And still, the answers remained consistent with the Bible. In 2019, Stripling declared, "Everything we see here meets the biblical criteria. This altar, it's here." He didn't demand blind faith. He didn't dismiss science. He simply pointed out that the biblical narrative was now accompanied by stones, bones, and ashes that seemed to recall what many had forgotten. But the most unexpected discovery was yet to come. A small lead object, folded like an ancient note, had been discarded decades earlier in the heaps of rubble from the original excavation. In 2022, while sifting through the archaeological debris left by Zertel, Stripling's team found this tiny tablet, just 2 centimeters long, no visible inscription. But they suspected, and they sent the piece for specialized analysis in Prague, where X-ray tomography revealed something extraordinary. Etched inside the lead, in a Proto-Sinaitic script, predating formal Hebrew, was a short but devastating message. It read, "Cursed, cursed, cursed by YHW," 3 times, a formula that directly echoes Deuteronomy 27, when the Levites were to proclaim curses from the top of Mount Ebal, the same hill, the same formula. And now, the same God etched in lead over 3,000 years ago. This piece of lead, now known as the Curse Tablet, may be the oldest written mention of the name of God, YHW, ever discovered in Israel. Older than the Giza calendar, older than the Silver Scrolls of Ketef Hinnom, older than most biblical narratives. For some scholars, this completely changes the timeline of Hebrew literacy. It means the Israelites knew how to read and write as early as the time of the conquest, not centuries later, as the so-called minimalists claim. But if the discovery was so remarkable, why didn't the world stop to listen? Why weren't there headlines in every newspaper, international conferences, updated entries in textbooks? The answer, unfortunately, is as old as the narrative itself. Not every truth is welcome, especially when it touches the foundations of modern certainties, prevailing ideologies, and established academic narratives. The world of biblical archaeology has been locked in a silent conflict for decades. On one side are the minimalists, like Israel Finkelstein, who argue that biblical accounts are later literary constructions, written centuries after the supposed events to legitimize a national identity. For them, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the early chapters of Israel are myths, not history. On the other side are the maximalists like Zertel, Stripling, and Professor Gershon Galil, who argue that the archaeological findings, though scarce, are more consistent with the biblical account than is often admitted. The altar, the bones, the pottery, the ramp, the absence of domestic structures, the timeline, everything points to something intentional, ritualistic, and strangely aligned with the text of Joshua. But accepting this would mean opening the door to something bigger, that perhaps the Bible is closer to the truth than many scholars would like to admit. And that's not just a matter of data, it's a matter of paradigms. Stripling in 2023 was blunt. The evidence is growing, but denial is still the academic orthodoxy. That statement resonates like an echo of the prophets themselves, crying out in the wilderness against hardened hearts. It's not that science opposes faith, it's that, often, it fears what faith might provoke if confirmed. Because if Joshua's altar really existed, what else existed? And what else is buried? Even more unsettling than the altar's structure was the content of the lead tablet. Not only does it mention the name of God, YHW, in an extremely ancient form, but it does so within a triple curse formula that directly recalls the Mosaic covenant. In Deuteronomy 27, it is said that half the people should stand on Mount Gerizim and the other half on Mount Ebal. There the Levites would proclaim blessings and curses, and the people would respond with a solemn Amen. Among the curses it reads, "Cursed be the one who makes a carved image. Cursed be the one who dishonors his father or mother. Cursed be the one who leads the blind astray." One by one, echoing what was perhaps etched in the lead before formal writing was even institutionalized. This detail is crucial because until recently, the dominant theory was that the Hebrews only began writing long after the conquest of Canaan. But now a small object, forgotten in a pile of rubble, threatens this entire timeline. And more, it confirms that the covenant made between God and the people on Mount Ebal may have been sealed with words and with writing. Writing that survived time, weather, and skepticism. And it's not just about an ancient altar or an enigmatic text, it's about a physical echo of faith, a mark in the ground, a testimony that doesn't bend to erosion. No residential structures, no work tools, no storage jars, only bones, ashes, stones, and a ramp, as if everything had been placed there with reverence, used for a brief moment, and then abandoned with the care of those who knew that place should not be profaned with routine. It was an altar, not a home. It was memory, not habitation. Every absence at the archaeological site is, paradoxically, a presence, The absence of daily life is what confirms its uniqueness. There were no houses around because it wasn't meant to be lived in. There were no tools because it wasn't meant for planting. There was only sacrifice, only purpose. The altar wasn't made to last, but to mean. And perhaps that's precisely what made it endure. The Bible has always been challenged for its historicity, but the sacred text has never defended itself with arrogance. It doesn't shout, it waits. It waits for time, waits for skeptics, waits for the stones to speak for themselves. And now perhaps they are beginning to speak. In a time when doubt is common currency and faith is treated as fantasy, the findings at Ebal emerge as a silent resistance, like the timid letters on a piece of lead. Small, fragile, but impossible to ignore. Some may say it's all still coincidence, that the altar was something else, that the tablet is from another time, that archaeology shouldn't bend to religious texts. But there's a difference between skeptical science and blind science. The former investigates with rigor, the latter dismisses before investigating. What we see here isn't definitive proof, but it's at the very least a call for intellectual humility. The psalmist wrote, "Truth will spring up from the earth, and righteousness will look down from the heavens." Psalm 85:11. Perhaps it wasn't just poetry. Perhaps it was prophecy. The earth, literally, is yielding forgotten truths. Truths that don't impose themselves with violence, but with coherence. That don't arise in temples, but in barren hills, with unhewn stones and burnt bones. At the end of the day, when the sun sets over the stones of Mount Ebal, you can see its silhouette forming something resembling an ancient altar. Drones capture the scene in silence, as if afraid to break the reverence of that place. And then a question echoes through the centuries. Is this just a pile of stones? Or is it a memory carved into the ground by obedient hands? Perhaps we'll never have an answer that satisfies all sides. Perhaps Joshua's altar will continue to divide opinions as it divided mountains. But even if experts hesitate, even if the world ignores it, the altar remains. The stones are there. The lead is there. The dust accumulates, but it doesn't erase. And what was said on that hill, what was burned there, what was proclaimed aloud, still resonates. Not as noise, but as sacred memory. Because in the end, history isn't made only of what we can prove. It's also made of what we choose to remember. And perhaps, before this silent altar, we should stop not to argue but to listen.